What you gonna do when Sheriff John Brown come for you?
Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation. My name is Troy Harnish. I'm a tactical paramedic. I'll be sharing with you some methamphetamine use and abuse information that's applicable for Canada as well as North America, and how it affects our practice as well as your community. Methamphetamine has been around for quite a while. It was used quite a bit in World War II in one form or another, and it's made a comeback in today's society. Unfortunately, it's the drug of choice. It's a fallback drug, actually, when users can no longer afford other drugs, such as cocaine and heroin, just because of the cost factor. The consistency and color can vary widely from batch to batch, and it depends to no small extent on how it's actually produced by the person that's actually cooking the batch. I put these slides up and pictures just as a little FYI, but really we shouldn't rely on this to identify whether or not meth is present in a particular home or actually in possession of a particular user. Because crystal meth squeezes the pleasure centers of the brain so much, it actually exhausts dopamine and other neurotransmitter levels to the point of where it takes 2, 3, 4 days or even more to replace them. These actually have to be replaced before the user can actually experience another high. Structurally, we've seen changes on a functional CT that indicates that these changes are permanent to the brain. It's important to remember that because it's working directly on the neurotransmitters, this drug is capable of producing extremely powerful emotions. Typically it's euphoria. It varies from user to user. It can also be paranoia, and users can actually have a very poor experience with this drug as well. Typically, if a person experiences paranoia or delusions, it'll reoccur for subsequent doses. Because it squeezes the pleasure center so hard, it actually does make structural changes to the brain, and afterwards the users are just incapable of experiencing those emotions. The new research out is also suggesting that the structural changes that occur to the brain as a result of abuse are extremely similar to paranoid schizophrenia, which makes telling the two apart very difficult. Meth users, and in particular meth users that are using higher doses, typically exhibit characteristics that are extremely dangerous to the EMS provider and any first responder for that matter. Someone who is invincible and thinks the world is out to get them, who is paranoid and has no concept of reality, is actually a very dangerous person and can turn at any time. A person may start with small doses, just using it recreationally, and occasionally binge, or they may go right to the high intensity and take frequent high doses. Because it does squeeze the pleasure center so much in the brain, the high can only exist for a certain amount of time, and then the brain needs a rest for 3 or 4 days to build up the neurotransmitters again. It should be noted that tweaking, or the end of the high, is actually the most dangerous stage of the abuser. After they come down from their high, they may not sleep for 3 to 15 days just because the chemistry in the brain is so messed up. They typically use alcohol, and it's a downhill ride for most of them, but they typically need something to take the edge off. This is an extremely dangerous phase for paramedics and law enforcement. This is typically where you're probably going to contact these abusers. This drug typically makes its presence known first in the rural communities and then moves into urban areas, which makes it pretty much the exact opposite of any other drug. Very popular in raves, which aren't all that common in the Maritimes, but it's also quite common for people that are hooked on other drugs, can no longer afford that drug, and have chosen to switch to it just to continue an abuse pattern, but they really can't afford anything else. This is one person followed over the course of years, and you can see that meth actually has a dramatic effect on the person's hygiene, appearance, and it basically just wrecks the body and accelerates aging by a factor of 10 to 15. So yet another user that has been tracked over the course of years by different police department photos, and you can notice that she actually goes from a fairly normal looking person into something that quite obviously looks like a junkie. The important thing to note is a lot of this is dose dependent. If someone starts off with a fairly high dosing regime, they're going to go through this fairly quickly versus an occasional user that may take 10, 12 years to develop this kind of change. Different people experience it different ways, and as you can see from these pictures, some people have dramatic differences inside a very short time frame. One thing I like to point out is the presence of sores that are very visible on the face, and these are extremely common with meth abusers and should be a pretty good tip-off to any EMS provider. The changes that the drug is capable of producing inside a very short time frame of high abuse is just incredible. As you can see from this before and after picture, a year and a half of abuse has basically taken away this person's humanity and looks. Again, you can note the meth sores and scabs on this person's face. The meth bugs that I mentioned are actually a process called formication, where the user actually feels that there are bugs crawling around underneath their skin, and they'll actually dig until they feel that they're getting at the root of the problem. And this can lead to ulcers, huge open wounds, and of course poor personal hygiene on top of that typically leads to a pretty big mess in this community of abusers. Track marks and abscesses, typically from poor intravenous drug hygiene and habits, makes vascular access very difficult at the best of times, but almost impossible the worst times. Should consider some alternate routes, such as IJs, EJs, or perhaps even a saphenous vein down in the ankle area. Should be considered for protocols if you're starting to see this type of pattern in your community. Meth mouth is common primarily from the destructive elements from smoking, but this also occurs when the drug is used intravenously as well. This can actually form in a very short time frame and is made worse by poor oral hygiene and high sugar content drinks that the abusers typically use to maintain themselves when they're tweaking or crashing. A large number of abusers are also involved in the process of cooking it or actually making meth. And of course, wherever there's a meth lab, there's also toxic gas, chemicals that are just horrendous, and fire explosion. As a matter of fact, in a recent survey, most meth cooks have actually stated that they've been involved in a fire explosion in their own lab or house. The EMS provider may be faced with the abuser in different points of their cycle, and the drug actually causes alterations in their normal body functions, including hyperglycemia, which can lead to HHNK over the course of an abuse cycle. They may cook their brain in the process of taking higher levels of the drug. If someone has a pre-existing issue with their blood pressure and they take the drug, no good can come of that. Making meth is extremely simple, unfortunately. It's just a matter of actually dissolving the pills, adding the precursors, just making a little subtle change to the ephedrine, separating it out, bubbling it through an acetic gas, and crystallizing it, then filter it off. It's a very simple process. Many of the meth cooks that were captured in the U.S., I believe 2/3 of them were illiterate. And of course, with progress comes a newer and better way to make crystal meth. This is a single step process. It's very easy to teach other people. Some of the precursors are a little bit more unstable, but when you're talking about a single step process that's so simple, this is a little bit more attractive than some of the other processes which involved more complex methods to make the meth. There are over 150 ways to actually make meth. Typically in any one community you're going to see one or two methods that are going to be favored. There have been a huge number of lab seizures in the U.S., primarily as a result of more awareness on the issue. In Canada, it's been very low, 30 to 50 per year over the past 5 years. We know that they're there. It's likely because we're not addressing the issue, and we're not seeing a lot of seizures. So, having said that, it's important for you as an EMS provider to actually know what these labs are like so that when you actually walk in to care for someone, you're going to make sure that you're provided for in terms of safety, as well as be able to recognize, identify, and report that lab to proper law enforcement before something bad comes to that actual scene. You may be surprised to see what an actual lab looks like. They can be almost anywhere. Rural locations are typically the first to see the labs, and as users get a little bit more savvy and meth cooks, they tend to move into more rural areas because city dwellers tend to notice things out of the ordinary. All these pictures are actual meth labs taken from actual busts, so this is what you are likely to see if you walk in on something. Smell of cat urine when cats are not present, garlic or rotting fish, cut hay or fresh corn are all good tips that meth is being cooked, and that's a good time for you to get your butt out of there. Messy housekeeping and meth lab, there's often a subtle difference, but things are going to seem out of place. Specifically, if you see Drano in the bedroom, solvents, any bottles with bi-level fluid are bad news and you want to avoid them. This is a large super lab that was actually busted in Montreal, Quebec. And these are very rare. They're typically run by gangs that are trying to produce this as a way of either controlling other areas or actual profit. But the profit margin on meth is fairly low, so these are not common at all. Now this actually just looks like a typical kitchen, and it's not until you actually start to look a little closer that some things tend to stand out. Now for example, there's a jar in the center of your screen with a red rag that kind of stands out and looks a little bit out of the ordinary, but there's acetone there as well, and one has to ask why an average person would have acetone in the kitchen. And you also notice a glass beaker just almost quite out of the shot on the left hand side of the screen. Pop bottles strung together with tubing are good indicators of meth labs and meth production. Solvents and drain cleaners out of place, for example, in a bedroom. Strikers and a large quantity of matchbooks are also another good indicator that someone's actually using the red phosphorus to produce meth. Here's a bunch of paraphernalia that was acquired during a series of busts. Top left, that looks like a nice, neat and cozy little thing you would find in a typical garage. Same bottom left, you'd expect to find that in almost any basement. The two things in the center I really want to draw your attention to is bi-level fluids. And specifically we're talking about a fluid that has two substances, two different levels. These are often very toxic and can kill with a single inhalation if someone opens those. Now for this bedroom, you'll notice that there's a jar towards the left that has a dark bi-level fluid. There's solvents, there's drain cleaners. These are not normal items to find in an average bedroom. And you should be especially careful if you notice as well strange odors. And this would be a good scene to avoid. can find labs almost anywhere. You'll notice top left, everything to actually make a cook or a batch is in a cooler. Bottom right, this is in the trunk of a car, and it was actually discovered after a low-speed collision with another vehicle. Oftentimes you'll see a pressure vessel such as a propane tank used to carry anhydrous ammonia that is used during one of the processes for meth production. Pound for pound, the chemicals that are generated as a result of making a batch are extremely hazardous. Pound for pound, they're actually almost as expensive to dispose of as nuclear waste. You can pick everything up you need from Walmart. It's very cheap and easy to do, and because of the volatility of the chemicals and the gases, it's common for fires and explosions to happen, and often these are how labs are discovered. Unfortunately for the meth cook, if they're exposed to toxic gas, often they're not discovered until they're not viable. In these cases, scene safety, where they're overcome by gas, scene safety for the paramedic is paramount, and SCBAs are required for entry and should really be deferred until a hazmat team or someone else with proper gear can actually make entry into these. Of course, it's very common for fires and for people to be burned in the process. Meth is a somewhat unusual drug in that people who have children will no longer care for the children after they're hooked on meth. They really don't care that the children exist. They're just kind of hangers-ons. They're often going to be in a neglectful situation. They're probably going to be poorly cared for, poor hygiene, and we are required by law to report that. An important thing to note is never take anything from a meth house, because these items are often contaminated. Now, these children, you can actually see, have been exposed to toxic chemicals and fumes as a result of being in the meth house. Again, the parents have little or no concern for these situations. They're really not able to care for themselves, and the children are just innocent victims caught up in all this. At any point, if you're dealing with a user who you suspect may be violent or is cooking meth, now is the time to involve police and sort it out earlier rather than later. Same goes if a medic suspects they're in a meth lab. A good thing to do is get out and sort it out on the sidewalk, because if you remain in that situation, it's normal to try to stay behind and help the person. You really have to get over that first impulse and get out of the house as soon as possible if you suspect something is going on. Educate your neighboring departments to the dangers of meth, and really build a rapport and relationship with local police and fire and drug enforcement. Keep tabs on what's going on in your community, whether or not there is meth, and if so, in what areas. Thank you for your attention. If you or a fellow medic is interested in becoming a tactical paramedic or learning more about the tactical paramedic program, I encourage you to visit the website up on the screen, offered by tacticalspecialties.com. They run a course every September down in Fort Ripley, Minnesota, and I highly recommend it. Thank you and stay safe.